New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Hello there. I am Ruth Miller, and this is New Thought Roots and Branches. And we've been exploring the basis on which current teachings have been offered, and we've been looking at all the ways the teachings have evolved. If we go to our first slide, we're going to be discussing today the Holmes brothers, both Fenwicke and Ernest. We'll talk more about Ernest later, but the combination of the two was a very powerful presence in the period between 1917 and about 1927, about 10 years. Then their combined efforts were experienced by many people for a long time after that. Up to now, we've gone through the generation that was born in the mid-1800s and taught through the early 1900s. And now we're working on this new generation. This past one was Emmett Fox. And Emmett Fox is one of the ones who grew up in the UK, and he studied directly with Thomas Troward. Well, the Holmes brothers overlap Emmett's ministry and also studied and were very inspired by Thomas Troward's work. So you can see where Ernest is on the map there near the bottom. We're down in that whole bottom generation of teachers, the people who were teaching until 1960 something. So from the turn of the century into the 1950s and 60s. In the next slide, we can see the picture of Ernest there in the corner. And there he is. And he's responsible for religious science. But most of us have not heard that his brother Fenwicke was a huge part of that process. So I wanted to have us take a look at what the two of them were teaching in the beginning stages prior to the emergence of science of mind. In the next slide, we see some pictures of the two of them. Fenwicke is the older brother. He's about 4 years older and has that quite head of hair of his was defining him. And then Ernest came along a few years later, and we get to see his younger self. That would have been him in the 1920s in the first photograph, all the way to the 1960s in the last. And then Fenwicke lasted. He stayed on the planet quite a bit after the Church of Religious Science was established and Ernest passed on. So he continued to have an influence for quite a while. Let's look at their early life in the next slide. We begin to see that the boys were born in rural Maine outside of the town of Lincoln. There were 9 kids, 9 boys on a farm, which was great because nobody had to do too many chores. But it was also hard on the parents. They hardly had any funds at all. They had 2 books in the household. One book was the Bible, as virtually everyone in New England had, a very old family Bible that was read out of regularly. Probably not every night, but certainly every few days or once a week or so. The other Bible this household had, or the other book this household had, was written by Henry Drummond, Natural Law in the Spiritual World. And it's actually one of the books that I put in the Library of Hidden Knowledge and translated into modern terms because it was so influential in the Holmes boys' early life. Now, this was a guy, Henry Drummond, was born in 1850s, that earlier generation, and he was not a New Thought teacher by any means. He was a Moody Bible missionary, if you will, in the wharf areas of Glasgow, Scotland, and other parts of Scotland. And he would travel around the world, a lot of time in Africa, teaching the Moody Bible. That's a very Protestant, Pentecostal, evangelical technique, approach to the Bible teachings. But when he wasn't doing that, he was teaching natural history. He was a science teacher, teaching evolution and geology and biology in a seminary in Glasgow. So it fascinates me that this one person was able to do the same. Well, this book that the Holmes boys grew up on, Natural Law in the Spiritual World, was saying that what we're experiencing in this human life is built on what was experienced in the mineral life that then was absorbed by plant life, that then was absorbed by animal life, and is now being absorbed by human life. This life essence in all these forms transformed at each level. And he is saying that our spiritual beingness is pulling us up through this stage of being, even as our human beingness pulls the minerals out of the soil, through the plants, through the animals, into the human experience. Now spirit is pulling us into a purely spiritual experience. So I give you that because I think you need to know this is what they grew up on. A fairly Protestant understanding, congregational in Maine, understanding of the Bible, and Henry Drummond's interpretation of God as spirit being alive and constantly pulling us into a higher state of being. And from there, then we go on into the rest of their life. They were very poor, so they had no expectation of being able to have any schooling at all, but a local private school called Gould's Academy was willing to take them. And there were a couple of years that Fenwicke in particular was not able to attend because he had to drop out of school, go earn the money to pay for it, and then come back and pay for his high school work. While he was there, though, he did so well that his instructor teaching him Greek, and that's something we're not used to thinking. In high school, they were getting Greek and Latin, a smattering of Hebrew, mostly to understand the Bible. They also got not just geometry and trigonometry, but much more applied science, much more applied mathematics than we're accustomed to thinking of as a high school diploma. But that was where Fenwicke was, and his Greek instructor arranged for him to get a tuition scholarship at a college in New England. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then Fenwicke went on and worked through. He had a bunch of small-time jobs, and the last years was able to work primarily as a tutor. He was 4 years older, and when he was graduating from college, Ernest was trying to decide what to do, and he decided not to do college. He went into the city of Boston to study elocution, okay? So we're looking at a couple of boys who were born in the 1880s who are now coming into their teens at the turn of the century. And at the turn of the century in Boston, we have a marvelous speaker named Mary Baker Eddy. So Ernest is there to learn how to speak, and of course he ends up in the Christian Science Church listening to this speaker and many other very powerful speakers in Boston at that time. To support himself, he apprenticed himself to a butcher. So we will see when we talk about Ernest's life in particular, that came in very handy in later years, that capacity to be a butcher. He supported himself for 2 years in Boston, and when was able to develop his skills in this public speaking area, but also became fascinated with the healing work of Christian Scientists. And most of the rest of his, developing his mastery before forming the Institute was spent trying to understand how did this particular practitioner manage to cause the healing process to work. When we go into the next slide, we see that when Fenwicke graduated from his college in Colby, College in Maine, still in Maine, not far from Lincoln. He then went on to the Hartford Theological Seminary. He was only able to attend for a couple of years because his health got to him, but through correspondence, he was able to complete the program and was ordained in the Congregational Church ministry. And he moved to California. He had a job on a ranch in the Ventura area. And then once he had earned enough money, he moved down to Venice, California, and became the pastor of the little Congregational church there in Venice. Well, Ernest moved in with him in 1917, and the two of them began to study this metaphysics, this stuff of how healing happened. And we'll learn more about that as we go forward. Later, after they practiced metaphysical healing and began studying and teaching it, he ended up being a speaker, Fenwicke did, at the Divine Science, the Church of Healing Christ, which was where Emmett Fox ended up becoming the minister. We think they overlapped a little bit along about 1928 to 1931, and then Fox was appointed that minister. Later in Fenwicke's life, he became president of something called the International College of Mental Science. And throughout his life, he wrote lots of books, 20 books at least, and at least 50 years of lecturing in America and in other countries. And we'll find out a couple of other things he did as we go forward. He was quite the charismatic character, and there are people who would rather study Fenwicke's work than Ernest's work. When we come on to what's going on with Ernest and Fenwicke in the next slide, it turns out Ernest went in 1912. I don't know why I said 17, because other things happened in 17. So Ernest and Fenwicke are both in Venice, California, running this little Congregational church in 1912. And they started a Boy Scout troop in a town that didn't have anything like that. And a lot of Ernest's time was spent doing that. He had found Boy Scouts very helpful when he was both in Boston and in Maine. In 1913, though, there was an issue. It came up in their town, and that was people were trying to launch public prize fighting. That is, people getting paid to fight in the town of Venice. Well, here they were. They had a Congregational church. They had a Boy Scout troop. The last thing they wanted was the kind of culture that goes along with prize fighting in Venice. So Fenwicke started, as the minister of the local church, to write letters to the editor in the local paper explaining why this was not going to work. And then the folks that wanted it would rebut, and then he would rebut, and they would rebut, and they would rebut. This went on for several months until the election happened, and Ernest and Fenwicke won. There was no prize fighting allowed in Venice, California. In the middle of all that process, they discovered the Los Angeles Metaphysical Library, and sitting on one of the end tables near one of the couches was a very small book, and some of you have seen it. It's usually yellow, orange in color, called the Edinburgh Lectures. Now remember, Ernest had been fascinated by the healing processes that Christian Scientists were accomplishing, but he didn't have any framework for explaining that beyond what he had in the Bible and Henry Drummond's work. Thomas Troward gave them a framework. He was fascinated. And of course, they immediately ordered as many copies of the various books that were coming out of Thomas Troward's work from then on. So they found the work. And in 1915, they decided to take a course of study, a correspondence course. Most good courses then were correspondence studies. And that was with Christian Larson, who also had worked with Troward's ideas, and he'd created two books, The Pathway of Roses, which had really affected Ernest early on. And then together they were studying The Ideal Made Real. This is a very interesting concept because this title is telling us that New Thought is, as I suggested months ago, weeks ago, however many sessions ago it was, that we are Neoplatonists. That is, we are taking the Platonic ideal, the ideal that in a realm outside of our normal experience, the ideal form exists. And from that ideal form, our consciousness brings forth into our experience what we have called reality. I call it small r reality. Other people call it the appearance or the illusion, right? So the ideal made real was saying not only is that happening, but we can actually bring that ideal form into our experience and live that capital R real. And I'm one who calls that our heavenly existence. The reality of our world is not the experience that we've been having, but the capital R reality of the ideal, or in the Native American world, of the archetypal, the essence, the spirit of our beingness. In the next paragraph, we see that as they started, or in the next slide, we see that as they started doing this work, Fenwicke got into a bit of a quandary. He said, I was in something of a quandary now, with my ear becoming more and more attuned to this new truth, my eye on its great possibilities, and my feet planted in the Congregational Church. The stirring new concepts began to creep into my sermons. Some members of my flock hearing it gladly, others, including our mother, who had moved out to California when the youngest grew up, watching me with wary eyes. All right? His mother had grown up on the Bible, and she wasn't sure that what he was saying was accurate. Next sentence, my heart was fully dedicated to God and service, but the way, for now, was not clear. And that's Fenwicke writing about his life at 33. In the next slide, we see what Ernest says in response to that. You know you don't believe in it anymore. Why try to preach it? So in 1917, Fenwicke resigned after being at the little church 5 years, resigned from the teaching and the preaching in the service, in the church context, and dedicated his life fully with his brother into the study and practice of metaphysics. Look, there. So, I'm glad to clear my throat at that one. The two of them together began to come up with a lecture series. In the next slide, we'll see that what they did is they set up a series of Sunday mornings at the Strand Theater in downtown LA. And they would alternate. One Sunday it would be Ernest, the next Sunday it would be Fenwicke. And they ended up having a good-sized congregation, a few hundred people at least, showing up on a regular basis. Now, one of the things that they learned along the way was people wanted something in writing about these ideas. And you may recall that Troward had that too. People would listen to the lectures that wasn't penetrating. They could hardly wait till he gave them the written version. So they created a magazine. They called it Uplift. And, well, it wasn't exactly complimentary of a lot of the teachings that were going on out there at that time because they understood this theory behind it. Other people were teaching people rote concepts, just affirm, negate and affirm, deny and affirm, deny and affirm, without any explanation of how it worked. They did know a little bit about some of the root teachers like Melinda Kramer and Emma Hopkins, but they were responding to what they were seeing in their students. They created a book that they called Healing at a Distance, and they formed a very interesting thing. They got hold of a house in Long Beach. I actually have seen this house because I was a Navy wife and we were stationed in Long Beach for a little while. And they turned it into what amounted to a nursing home, very similar to a Christian Science nursing home, but it was all metaphysical using the Troward understandings of how healing happens. And you may recall that's moving from the objective normal awareness into the subjective mind. So we move from our thinking about what normally is into our knowing of what is real, and then we tell the body to align on what is real. And that was the beginning of this image that Ernest began to live with of what is real in the ideal can be made our experience. We can experience it in our consciousness, and then it becomes our experience in our body. And they did this, they kept this one going for quite a while, another 10 years or so. Then in 1919, they both published more books. Fenwicke published The Law of Mind in Action and How to Develop Faith That Heals, and Ernest published his book, Creative Mind. So 1919 was really the launching of their presence in the world. And you can see in the next slide, some of the things that are currently available. There's the Law of Mind in Action over there on the one side with the pillars. There is the current volume of several of their books in that kind of rose-colored. And then in the middle is their poem. It really is. It's a poem. Now, you may recall that I had said when James Allen was studying some of this material, he found something by Edwin Arnold, which was a poem, a long story poem about the Buddha, and it had inspired him tremendously. And I think that Ernest and Fenwicke were modeling on this poem about Buddha's life in this poem they're calling The Voice Celestial. It went on for quite a while, and it was 2 or 3 different voices. The main voice was the person they call the farer or the wayfarer, who is saying, I'm looking for this, I'm wanting this, I'm ready to experience this. And then there is this other voice that comes in and says, try this, look at that, explore this, make that happen. So it's in some ways our own journey as we begin to open up to discovering and experiencing the power of the infinite voice, the infinite wisdom that is always available to us. As we continue their life story, we'll get more into the content, but as we continue in the next slide, the following year, after these books came out, they kind of drew straws, and Fenwicke ended up attending the INTA meeting, the International New Thought Alliance meeting in Boston. You may recall that the first one was in 1914. That was the one that organized them. And then they went over to London and they organized the International New Thought Alliance in London with Troward present. Now in 1920, Fenwicke attended the meeting with their books in tow, and he wrote a talk. He called it The Passing to Form, the passing of spirit into form. And then he later created that as a pamphlet because that was part of their understanding. If you've got a pamphlet that goes along with your talk, people are often going to pay for that. And then it became the basis for a later book called Being and Becoming. And that book, Being and Becoming, is on many, many people's shelves who've never ever heard of religious science, which I think is fascinating. He went on from that meeting in Boston, having made some connections with some New Yorkers, and began to speak 3 times a day at a group called the League for the Larger Life. And they met in a big house, and people would be crawling on the stairs and then, in any way they could. It was overflowing crowds to listen to what Fenwicke had to say. Again, most people had not been familiar with the theoretical framework that Troward provided and that Fenwicke and Ernest were operating from all the time and were helping people to understand. And from there, he was invited to speak at the Church of the Healing Christ, the one that Emmett Fox had become minister of later, which happened to be a member. The church was a member of the League for the Larger Life in New York City during that 1920s period. If we look at the next slide, we get a picture of some of the folks who were involved in that time period. which is fascinating to me because we have all ages represented and even some overlapping racial shifts that were not acknowledged by a lot of people. So I'm glad we have people of color as well as these men. Notice they are all men. In most of our pictures up to now, it's been almost all women. This is actually kind of a branch of New Thought that's just beginning. And the idea of being active and effective in the business world was beginning to emerge in the 1920s. And Fenwicke was part of that movement. As we go on to the next slide, then we see this basic concept, change your thought to change your life, becoming institutionalized. The two of them together in 1924-25 attended this marvelous group, the International New Thought Alliance. And here they began to speak together and separately, and they began to expand, if you will, what they were experiencing. Now, you may recall that I mentioned when we were talking about Nona Brooks that Ernest Holmes followed her at the 1918 meeting, and he had said that he began to understand her particular approach, how her healing power was so effective. He said, I know your secret. I've seen your secret. It is omnipresence. In Nona Brooks' experience, there is no place, no cell, no experience where the divine good is not present. You may recall that in that show. Well, in 1918, he had done that. But at that 1918 meeting, Ernest had tried to have some time alone with Emma Curtis Hopkins and had not actually succeeded. And Fenwicke in 1920 tried to have time with her, but had not succeeded. But in 1924, after Emma had her year off because of heart issues, she came back into New York City. And when Ernest was in New York on this lecture tour, he was able to visit with her. She finally accepted. He came in and had an interview with her. And out of that series of interviews, he ended up writing Science of Mind in 1925. So they continued their lecture series. They've got this metaphysical nursing home going in Long Beach. They occasionally are, now they're mostly in the New England area doing, building their audience there. They do go back to the LA area. And in 1927, they formed the Institute of Religious Science and School of Philosophy. No church, all right? They created something where people could practice and learn. And in that institute and in that school, Ernest focused on meeting with people and providing healing treatments, and Fenwicke focused on teaching the classes and making sure that the curriculum was of the highest possible. The next slide, we see that in their own lives, they began to shift and change. 1927 was the year that Ernest married, I put Holmes, I meant Ernest, married Hazel Durkee Foster, and she helped to fund the Institute, and they created a beautiful home that many people love to visit. And in 1934, having wandered some more, Fenwicke met and married Catherine Eggleston. Now, he was at an INTA meeting and doing some lectures with the Literary Society in New York when he met her. She's a novelist, and they moved to Santa Monica in 1934, where he continued to teach. And he wrote several more books, including what he called tiny texts on this idea. And he wrote several books of poetry. But the interesting thing about the next phase in what Fenwicke was doing is after World War II, he began a correspondence with a Japanese teacher who had taken one of Fenwicke's books, that Creative Mind book from way back when, and translated it into Japanese. In the next slide, we find that Masaharu Taniguchi contacted him, and together they wrote The Science of Faith. Fenwicke hung out in Japan with Masaharu to help create the equivalent of the Institute of Religious Science in Japanese. and they called it Seichi no Ie. Okay? Seichi no is the infinite all that is, and Ie is present. Okay? So it is a Japanese New Thought movement. I first encountered this when one of my seminary cohort was there as part of this in this country. She had married a Japanese man, and they had found it in Japan, and now she was practicing it and learning it and developing her ministry through Seichi no Ie. A marvelous work. And this book, Miracle Man of Japan, is a beautiful explanation of it. I've given you here the three main principles that Fenwicke and Masaharu began to elucidate. So first is, only the God-created perfect world exists. Nothing else exists. That's back to the ideal is what's real. Nothing else is real. Everything else is called appearance or illusion. It's what comes from our thinking, comes from our consciousness about the reality. The second point, all phenomena are manifestations of the mind. That is, if we can perceive it, if we can experience it, it's happening through our mind, not as the ideal, which is all that really exists. The ideal is all that really exists. Our mind then manifests from that what it can conceive of and bring forth into reality. And then the third point, all religions emanate from one universal God, one universal beingness. So at root, all religions are the same. So this Japanese New Thought movement came into being because of Fenwicke's early writings and him being willing and able to work with Masaharu Taniguchi and make it happen. And that was in the 1950s, after the World War II was ended and the Americans were once more welcome in the country of Japan. So what are the concepts that Ernest and Fenwicke shared? In the next slide, we see how some of those ideas that the Japanese movement picked up on are expressed. The greatest power in the world is the power of thought, for it is creative mind in action. All right? There is no power greater than our own thought. Wow. The second point, nothing exists that did not first exist in thought. From the first sun that blazed only in the mind of the Creator to the last doll dress fashioned by a childish hand. Isn't that marvelous? I love that. So they're building on Troward's idea that beingness begins to contemplate its selfness, and in that becomes the possibility of form only in thought. And then as the thought of form happens, form comes into manifestation. So beingness in self-contemplation is existing in thought. All form exists first in that self-contemplation. And they went on in this basic concepts. Science supports the fact that the first movement in nature can have come only from the application of an immaterial force or will to the primary etheric particles, and we're talking the 1920s here when the ether was norm, but we're now beginning to call it the quantum field, to the primary etheric particles otherwise in a perfect state of equilibrium. So normally there's just isness, and then thought happens, and from thought comes a particular form, whatever that particular form may be. This is the kind of idea that is expressed in some part of the Vedantas, and that the quantum mechanical professor, Amit Goswami, who wrote the textbook on quantum mechanics, began to explain in his first book after he retired, called Self-Aware Universe. Thought has to be there. And self-contemplation and awareness must be present in order for form to form. And therefore, the universe must be a self-awareness taking form based on thought. So current physics in the form of quantum physics explains, and the Vedanta explains, and many other traditions help explain these basic ideas. In the next slide, we see that what these two men thought they were doing together was a study of applied metaphysics, metaphysics being beyond the traditional physics. And we're applying that in a variety of ways in their nursing home, in their teachings, in their writings, in the treatments that Ernest was providing. Our study of applied metaphysics is designed to make clear this set of facts, what is following after that. In the beginning, there is only mind or spirit, straight out of Troward. Whatever is made, therefore, must be made out of mind. Mind can act only by thinking, right? Mind can't do anything, it can only think. Therefore, it is thought that takes the substance called mind and molds it into form. The self-awareness thinks and brings forth, molds form, which becomes our experience. And so the next point is logical from that. Whatever that self-existent stuff is that they are calling God makes a world or a universe out of himself. As everything in the cosmos starts in thought and manifests in form, creation is the process by which the activity takes place. That is the creative process. That's what Troward calls God. The creative process is constantly going on, and all activity in the universe is this creative process unfolding. Fenwicke and Ernest were taking those ideas, those metaphysical ideas, their practice, which they got through the Christian Science world, and the ideas that they had learned and the practices they had learned from all the people they had interviewed, and developed this science of applied metaphysics. And then he says, creation is the process. The next point is we may call it evolution, or we may call it law. By law, we mean the method spirit follows in making things. So the law of mind is the method of spirit, the law of attraction, the law of cause and effect. It's the process, the method by which spirit makes form, by which the infinite beingness, isness, thinks into beingness form. And since we are part of all of that, as we think, we are bringing into form. And that's how things are made. Excuse me. So that brings us into the next slide. Excuse me. All right. So whatsoever way we approach our subject, we find an underlying unity to all things, whether it's from the material standpoint, or in this case, they're saying ether from the material standpoint, or mind from the mental. So ether would be what we're calling the quantum field today, the infinite substance that is spirit. And the second point, back of all things then, is the divine mind or spirit, through whose concept, whose thought, whose idea, whose image, the world springs into existence. The whole of all that is, the universe springs into existence. Remember, again, we're talking back here in the 1920s. And then the point, we thus find ourselves living in an idealistic or an ideal universe, a universe which in its essential nature is purely spiritual, and therefore subject to the control of thought alone. The universe is subject to the control of thought alone. That's a huge leap for many, many, many people, because we're accustomed to thinking, oh, this huge universe and I'm a small part of it and it can't possibly, there's no way I can make a difference. Yeah, that's what we've been taught to believe. But they're saying that thought is the only control in this universe. And the two of them were living this and reinforcing it in all of their interactions and in their writings and in their lectures. And they did this for years. Fenwicke remained part of the Institute in various ways for years. And as we will discover later, that was Ernest's life for the rest of his life. As we look in the next slide, we begin to see the ending of their working together. They moved on. And moving on is normal. Life is change, isn't it? So where Ernest focused on building the Institute and ultimately establishing a church and doing radio and TV, and he passed in 1960. So from 1927 to 1960, that plus his life with his wife, was the essence of Ernest's life. And we'll talk about some of the details of that in another program. Fenwicke stayed married to his lady. They had a lovely home, and they stayed together for the rest of his life. And he focused on his writings and his studies. He did go back to Japan a couple of times to work with the Seicho Noe. And he also went on to some other countries. But he passed in 1973. And very few of us ever heard of him. Isn't that interesting that so many people, that James Allen or Henry Drummond, or who have been so key to our understanding, or to the teachers' understandings that we have relied on, we have not heard of. And in this case, it was well into the current generation that Fenwicke was still teaching and writing. So we're beginning this new generation, the ones that were born at the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th, and we're teaching well into the middle of the 20th century. And they were the ones who were beginning to have to include the remarkable shifts and changes in the realms of science, the ideas of the relativity theory, the beginnings of quantum physics, the realization that electricity and radio waves were not flowing through a substance, but that something else was going on. And that there is an invisible process. When physicists began to get that much of what is going on in the universe, virtually everything that's going on in the universe, is at a realm that we can't even begin to contemplate, much less measure. This is a whole different world. And that's the next generation that Ernest and Fenwicke basically founded and launched. As we look now at the Holmes brothers' metaphysics, their applied metaphysics, we can realize that we are living what they were discovering and teaching with great gratitude and appreciation. Ernest and Fenwicke, the authors of The Voice Celestial, an amazing poem, and many marvelous books, were here for us years before most of us were born, but they set an example and a process in place that many of us are relying on today. Thank you very much for joining me here on New Thought, Roots and Branches. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.